So on to Sigmund Freud. We're going to give him somewhat short shrift, I'm afraid, because we only have an hour to talk about Freud, but that's okay. We can get a fair way through it. He's still persona non grata, I would say, among experimental psychologists and probably clinical psychologists as well, but that seems to me to be very unfair. Freud is one of those thinkers who all that's left are his mistakes. And the reason for that is that everything that he discovered or put forward is so entrenched in our culture now that we think it's self-evident. And so everything correct has been assimilated, and that just leaves everything that's more or less floating on top to look wrong. But Freud is also one of those thinkers who was always wrong in an interesting way, and that's very useful. And so I also think that many of the things that he put his finger on that are of still disputed, for example, the idea of the Oedipus complex, are much more useful than people are willing to admit, especially in the clinical realm, because the Oedipal complex, which we'll talk about quite a bit, is actually a description of a fairly stable form of familial psychopathology where the child gets trapped within the confines of a family because the relationship with one parent or the other or both is so tight that they can't break beyond it, and maybe because of their own inability to move towards independence, but more frequently because of what you might describe as a kind of conspiracy between the son and the parent, or the child and the parent, that prevents them from moving towards autonomous life and keeps them in a state of, essentially a state of childhood dependence. Freud said, "I started my professional activity as a neurologist trying to bring relief to my neurotic patients. Under the influence of an older friend and by my own efforts, I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious in psychic life, the role of instinctual urges and so on. Out of these findings grew a new science, psychoanalysis, a part of psychology, and a new treatment for the neuroses. I had to pay heavily for this bit of good luck. People did not believe in my facts and thought my theories unsavory. Resistance was strong and unrelenting. In the end, I succeeded in inquiring pupils and building up an international psychoanalytic association, but the struggle is not over." He made that recording just shortly before he died. He moved to England to escape the Nazis. Before Freud, I guess, the mind was, it's complicated because Freud, of course, was not the only person to be thinking along the lines that he thought. Pierre Janet, who was one of his teachers, had originated and started to develop many of the ideas that I would say were popularized by Freud. But the idea of the unconscious mind was certainly not as well developed prior to Freud as it became afterwards. And before that, I suppose you might say that insofar as people thought of the mind at all, they thought of in philosophical terms, and the mind would be that part of you that you're aware of, like in the Cartesian sense. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," and it kind of seems in some sense self-evident that you're aware of and have control over the contents of your own mind. But that was what Freud really questioned, and he questioned it deeply. He said, well, first of all, the idea that you're one thing, like one mind, is a dubious idea to begin with, because people are full of internal contradictions. And then the idea that your mind is all of one type, it's all of one form, was also very questionable as far as Freud was concerned, because you could be fractionated into subcomponents. And the idea, for example, that your anger or your sexual desire could be an autonomous part of your personality in some sense, that it could overtake you and control you, that's really a Freudian idea. And one of the classic Freudian ideas really is that people are made out of subpersonalities, and those subpersonalities are alive. And that's one of the things I really like about the psychoanalytic thinkers, because even the psychologists who say over the last 30 years or thereabouts, since maybe longer now, anyways, since the demise of behaviorism as an ideology, and the admission by psychologists that there were there is an active unconscious, or many active unconsciouses, which is a better way of thinking about it. Psychologists still really haven't come to terms with the idea in any deep sense that these unconscious processes are living things. You know, when psychologists talk, for example, about the cognitive unconscious, they're talking about something that they describe in more machine-like, with more machine-like metaphors, and that's not reasonable. You understand things a lot better if you understand that the subcomponents that make up people, the fragmentary bits of them, and also the biological subsystems that are part and parcel of your being, are much more intelligently viewed as personalities. They're kind of unidimensional personalities in some sense, so that, for example, if you're angry, you're nothing but angry. I mean, that's an overstatement, obviously. Or if you're afraid, you're nothing but afraid. Or if you're hungry, you're nothing but hunger. Well, that's certainly true if you get hungry enough, or thirsty, or too hot, or any of those things. You kind of collapse to a simpler personality that only has one motivation in mind. And we'll talk a lot as we progress about the grounding of those unidimensional motivational systems in biology. But I'd have to say that Freud was among the first, at least the first, to synthesize a coherent theory of this multiplicity, and to put it forth while also insisting that much of what was happening to you and inside of you was not immediately accessible to your awareness. And it's a very profound discovery. It means, among many other things, that you can formulate ideas. First of all, it means that you can act out things that you don't understand for reasons that you don't understand. It also means that your memory can contain things that's represented in one way, but that can't be understood in another. So, for example, and we know this is true because there are independent memory systems. There's an independent memory system for procedures, that's for actions. There's an independent memory system for what you might describe as imagination, for the memory that uses images. And then there's another system that articulates knowledge. That's the semantic memory system. And it's not obvious at all that the contents of all of those are equivalent. And that's why, for example, you can dream things that you don't know, because one of the things you might think is that your dreams watch you act, and they watch other people act, and then they make a little drama out of that, and that drama has information in it, but you don't necessarily know what that information is, in that you can't describe it consciously, right? It's akin to the Piagetian idea that kids can play a game and you can take them away from the game, and then they won't know how to describe the rules, even though they can play the game. And so dreams can contain information that's full of the encoding of behavior that has information in it that you're not consciously aware of. And so then you can become consciously aware of that in a kind of a revelation, say. Maybe that's what you do when you become aware of the meaning of a dream, or the meaning of a fantasy, or something like that. And that's all our ability to think that way, in some ways, can be traced back to Freud. Now, Freud concentrated mostly on, I would say, at least in terms of pathology, on sexual and aggressive impulses. And I don't think that there's any mystery for modern people about why aggressive impulses might be particularly difficult to integrate into the personality, and might remain underdeveloped, or we'll say repressed, although those aren't the same thing. And I think you might think that in different times in society, some things are allowed to surface and express themselves, and other things are less allowed. And so Victorian times had a number of characteristics that made the repression of sexuality particularly likely, and perhaps also the repression of aggression. And we're talking about Victorian times in Europe, obviously, and only one time and one place. As Henry Ellenberger says, this is a great book, by the way, The Discovery of the Unconscious. If you're really interested in psychoanalytic ideas, Freud, Jung, and Adler, and also the history of those ideas, there's no better book than The Discovery of the Unconscious. It's an absolutely remarkable book, a great work of scholarship. I think it goes for about 250 pages before it even gets to Freud, and so it places Freud's discoveries in their historical context, so that's a really good thing to know. Ellenberger says, it was a world shaped by man for man, in which women occupied the second place. Political rights for women did not exist. The separation and dissimilarity of the sexes was sharper than today. Women who wore slacks, their hair short, or smoked were hardly to be found, and The universities admitted no female students. Man's authority over his children and his wife was unquestioned. Education was authoritarian. The despotic father was a common figure and was particularly conspicuous only when he became extremely cruel. Laws were more repressive, delinquent youth sternly punished, and corporal punishment was considered indispensable. Now, so the times themselves, I would say, were harsher and more repressive, but then there was an element to sexuality that was also extraordinarily problematic. I mean, the first thing you might notice, might consider, and people generally don't, it's almost impossible to overstate how revolutionary the birth control pill actually is. You know, people like to think that the political rights that women have attained have been a consequence of a political struggle, but I don't buy that for a second. I don't think that's true even in the least. I think that what happened was that we underwent a biological revolution in the 1950s, late 1950s, with the emergence of the birth control pill, and that, for the first time in human history, gave women pretty reliable control over their reproductive function, and that really transformed them into entirely different biological beings in many, many ways. Like, here's an example, a subtle example. So, you know, if you track women through their ovulation cycle and you show them a picture of a man, the same man, and you do nothing but vary his jaw width, when they're ovulating, the guy with the wider jaw is more attractive, and when they're not ovulating, the farthest away from that, the guy with the thinner jaw is more attractive, and that's associated with testosterone levels. And so women who are fertile like more masculine men, and basically if you're on the pill, then you're never in that ovulation phase. And so one thing that may have happened, and I don't know this for sure, but it's interesting to consider, is that since women have been taking the birth control pill, their preference for less masculine men has become more pronounced. And that could easily be one of the things that's fueling at least some of the tension that's existed and exists now politically between men and women. But the point is that you just cannot ignore the massive consequences of a biological revolution like that, and to make any other factor causal when you're trying to understand the political movements, especially in the last, say, 40 years, you're putting the cart before the horse. Now, it's reasonable to point out that the pill wouldn't have been accepted as a technology if certain political changes with regards to the emancipation of women hadn't already been in place, right? No one would have even been allowed to do something like investigate contraception. So you can't separate the biological from the political entirely, but it's still very useful to organizing your thinking to realize just how profound a revolution that was. But now, back in the Victorian times, see, there's another thing about sexuality. Modern people like to think that there's nothing dangerous about sex, and that is like the stupidest thing you could possibly ever hypothesize, because everything about it is dangerous. It's dangerous emotionally, it's dangerous socially, it's dangerous because of the possibility of unwanted pregnancy, and it's dangerous because of the possibility of sickness, and that's a major one. I mean, so when AIDS emerged in the 1980s, that could have easily killed all of us. Now, the fact that it didn't was wonderful, but it did kill hundreds of millions of people. So it was no joke, it was a big deal, and AIDS mutated to take advantage of promiscuity. And so the relationship between sexual behavior and the transmission of disease is actually mediated at the biological level. But anyways, back in the 1890s, they had the same problem, right? They had the problem with syphilis. And syphilis is one nasty disease. It can mimic almost any other disease, and it's devastating to your nervous system, and you can pass it on to your children. And so part of the reason that sexuality was heavily repressed in the Victorian period was not only because of the possibility of unwanted pregnancy, the relative poverty of people. You know, back in 1895 in Europe, the average person lived on less than $1 a day in modern terms. You know, it's almost impossible to understand how poor people were. And so sex in a poverty-stricken place is also a lot more dangerous than it is in a rich place, because especially if given the lack of employment opportunities for women back in the Victorian period, if you happened to get pregnant out of wedlock, you were in serious trouble. And so the fact that sexuality was repressed is hardly a surprise, because it was so difficult to integrate into the full-fledged personality, you know, and as it still is. So sexual repression, supposedly characteristic feature of the Victorian period, was often merely the expression of two facts: the lack of diffusion of contraceptives and the fear of venereal disease. It was all the more dangerous because of the great spread of prostitution, and because prostitutes were almost invariably contaminated